are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces, bright and early for their daily races, going nowhere, going nowhere. Their tears are filling up their glasses, no expression, no expression. Hide my head, I want to drown my sorrow. No tomorrow, no tomorrow.
Hi there. This is Dean Walker from the outpost in the interwebs called Living Resilience. We also produce the YouTube channel podcast called The Poetry of Predicament. Good chance you could be watching that that YouTube channel right now, and you might be watching this as a part of our in-house long form course called Islands of Sanity in a Mad World. And in that context, you will probably have watched a whole series of podcast episodes that have led up to this one. And the whole purpose or focus of this particular podcast series is to look at the roots of fascism in the USA 2025. And you would know by now, if you're watching those, or you may well know on your own, that these roots go back decades, primarily for the group that has been assembling the dark alliance of very powerful groups here in the USA in the past few years as the culmination of a decades-long plan of action to bring the US government and culture under the domination of the Christo-fascist element of the US religious faith community, which is primarily made up of evangelicals and Catholics. And they've been under the auspices of the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, certainly for decades. And primarily in these past 10 years or so, they've been formulating their decades-long process into an action plan that they have called Project 2025. There are other elements, and we won't be talking about those other ones like Project Esther and so on. There are so many other details that we could be including here, but really this is meant to be a first of a two-part series that is really the capper of the ultimate series, this Roots of Fascism in the USA. And this particular capper, if you will, is to me extraordinary. It's like a punchline that literally is like a punch in the face. It has been now months in the making for me because it's one of the most difficult topics I've ever had to grapple with. After 10 years of providing resources and support and practices for the collapse-aware and collapse-acceptant communities here on the interwebs, this is easily the most disturbing material I've had to deal with, even far more so than the layers of deniers and the corporate billions of dollars spent on disinformation to stop or slaughter the environmental movement in the USA and around the world. Those look like small potatoes compared to what's at stake in this particular round, as the Project 2025 alliance, dark alliance, if you will, have been kicking into action um, ever since the Trump 2.0 presidency began. So this is again the first of a two-part series to describe and actually hopefully answer some of the most difficult questions that have started to surface since the really disturbing actions of the Trump 2.0 presidency and the destruction and particularly the cruelty that appears to be a vital part of this Project 2025 realization. If you haven't yet seen any of the previous episodes of this special focus series of podcasts from Living Resilience about the incursion of fascism in the US government in 2025, just a brief rundown of the focus of that series is we've chosen four of the most powerful groups of the many groups that were put together by the Heritage Foundation as an alliance, a dark alliance, if you will, to be able to make this happen, not just as an expression of evangelical desire, but also to find allies, powerful allies, moneyed allies, to be able to realize this plan in short order. The first of the four groups that we focused on in that series was, of course, the Christian nationalists, also called Christo-fascists. And so there were a few episodes detailing their growth, their evolution over decades. There have been more than 50 years in the long game realization of that which is now called Project 2025, and which, the culmination of it appears to be the incursion into every level of US governance by these Christo-fascist um, expressions at every level. So that's what the first few episodes of this special focus series on US fascism in 2025, that was the focus of the first few. The second group that we spent some time speaking about was what's now being called the broligarchs, the exceptionally wealthy and powerful AI and Silicon Valley executives who bring their money and their alliance and their power, their influence, which is hard to overstate given that this is truly the era of AI. And AI is a massive part of what is fundamentally changing the inner workings of how US governs itself. Um, that we've covered quite a bit in the series of previous episodes. It's mentioned a bit here. And by the way, if you haven't seen those previous episodes and you would like to, there's a link in the show notes here to be able to take you to that menu of all the episodes that have preceded this one. These, what will be two. The third group is one that I really didn't have an easy name to apply to them, but I would call them the old timer business crew, the long-standing titans of industry who have really had so much control over the US governance and not just influence on US government, but also tremendous influence on where to send the CIA around the world over the past 100 years to be able to realize more and more fruitful environments for U.S. industry to profit. The amount of control, the amount of damage, the amount of very cynical influence that we've exercised around the world has really come at the behest of these old timer titans of industry characters. So, in this first episode of two about the roots of fascism, these this group does figure prominently, and you'll hear more about them and why we've included them in this particular endpoint mini series. You'll hear more about that in the second episode, but you'll be hearing about all of these four in more detail in the second episode as well. So, the fourth group that we will be mentioning both here and in the second and final episode is the group of financiers. Again, I don't really have a clever name or moniker for them, but they are truly, as they like to call themselves, the masters of the universe. They are the people in the corner offices of financial institutions and organizations that are very difficult to overstate the amount of power that they have, due primarily or really exclusively to the amount of money that they wield. We're all aware to some degree or another, but I think you'll find that it can be quite surprising to see how much they have gotten their tentacles also, like the Broligarchs, into the inner workings of governments around the world. Very hard to overstate the amount of power and influence that they have. And of the four groups, this is by far the quietest. They are the least public with their image, with their power, with their displays of their influence. They don't do that much, and they don't need to, and they don't want to. They are not particularly interested in being well known. They just want to keep wielding the scale of power that they do. So those are the four groups that you're going to be hearing about again a little bit in this particular first of two episodes. So in this part one of the core of fascism, what is at the core of this fascist tidal wave that has come through since January of 2025. There have been a few profound questions showing up from time to time, even in our relatively ineffectual mainstream media. These questions keep surfacing. And so I'd like to just mention a few of the questions and point toward hopefully what we will find is some answers to these very, very difficult questions. So let me just roll a few out. So what is actually driving the slash and burn campaign here in the US Doge program that we've been watching since Elon Musk took the helm of that in early 2025? Why is it such a slash and burn campaign? Why does it have to involve such decimation of the federal agencies that it's touching? And how does it determine which of those agencies it's going to touch and which ones it will slash and burn? Another question that's been showing up is how can the violence and corruption, rage and fear created by this Trump 2.0 administration be justified? How can they be justifying the amount of violence, the amount of corruption, the amount of rage and fear that this has welled up in the US and worldwide communities? How can it be justified? Why is this administration focusing its cynical actions against America's most vulnerable populations? Populations like the children and child care, health care, and education of children. The elderly, Social Security, of course, and not to mention Medicaid and Medicare. And immigrants, the mass deportations, terrorizing tactics in arresting alleged illegal immigrants, and those immigrants being shipped to concentration camps, either here in the USA or abroad, without any due process. Truly terrifying. Why is this administration focusing on those vulnerable populations? Could it be that starting with a focus on these most vulnerable populations is all just a warm-up for the full activation of the Project 2025 agenda? To be able to detain, arrest, imprison, or even kill any American citizen at will. That can sound like hyperbole, especially if you haven't seen the episodes of this series that led up to now. But as you'll soon see, all of these terror tactics are being shifted to include U.S. citizens at any level of society as we know it. Let's start this first episode with an introduction to a profoundly disturbing book that appears to feature prominently in the Project 2025 rollout or action plan for the Trump 2.0 presidency. This introduction to this disturbing book will be delivered by, ironically enough, a long reformed ex-fundamentalist Christian who now spends his time podcasting about the dangers of those evangelicals and Christo-fascists and their devastatingly legal project to bring the entire USA under the domination of a Christian nationalist government and culture. I introduce to you a powerful speaker and again, a reformed evangelical himself, Frank Schaeffer.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer. I am an author and a commentator, and I come out of a far right-wing religious background that I long since led, and I've spent 40 years trying to undo some of the damage my family did. But one advantage of my background is that I think I have some special insight into right-wing activities and the underlying currents that inform them. Well, recently I found out something that really is a window into the soul, character, and being of Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance. It's also, by extension, a window into the soul, character, and being of Donald Trump, that he would appoint J.D. Vance as vice presidential candidate, a man who, in office, would be within a heartbeat of an old man of the presidency. You know, once in a while, a detail floats into the public space that tells you everything you need to know about someone, period. And as an author, I've written a dozen or so books. One of the details that I look for is not just what people read, but what they're influenced by. And so I was shocked and horrified, literally shocked, to find that J.D. Vance had given a promotional quote, what we call in the book trade a blurb that you see on the cover of a book, endorsing a book by a far-right author who literally, quite literally, not throwing the word around loosely, but literally endorses fascism, whose heroes are Francisco Franco of Spain, whose heroes include Joseph McCarthy. And he has written a book called Unhumans. Unhumans. And the thesis of that book is that anyone on the left, a liberal or a Democrat, in other words, most Americans who are not to the far right MAGA orientation, are literally, according to the title, Unhumans. And in this book called Unhumans, claims are made that if J.D. Vance made them from a podium, would elicit either laughter or gasps, but somehow by endorsing them in a book, we get a view of what J.D. Vance really means. For instance, he says that the hero of the Spanish Civil War, Francisco Franco, who overthrew the democratic Second Spanish Republic in the 1930 Civil War, did the right thing. Did the right thing by up into including executing his political enemies. The book goes on to talk about the fact that Augusto Pinochet of Chile is a hero, that he did the right things. Let's remember what his technique was with his opponents, people he also called unhumans. He had his military collect them by the hundreds, torture them to death, throw political prisoners from helicopters into the sea, chain women to beds who were pregnant because he was a traditional Catholic, deliver the babies, hand them to doctors. Those children were then given to other people and adopted, while the woman, still raw, still bleeding, still injured from delivering the baby, was taken out and shot. In the book Unhumans, Pinochet is held up as a hero. And who holds up this book as instructive and something we all ought to learn from? J.D. Vance. Who else endorses this book? Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump Jr. The foreword is by Steve Bannon, one of Donald Trump's chief strategists. So this is not some little chance occurrence, a book called Unhumans that is just a freak thing where maybe J.D. Vance didn't read the book all the way through. Although, as someone who is asked to blurb about 50 books a year, of which maybe I choose 2 or 3 to write comments on, because I've had the good fortune to be a best-selling author at times. So I'm asked to blurb all sorts of books. And guess what I never do? I never give a comment on a book praising it unless I've read it, and nor does anyone else sane. So when you look at what they're talking about, and when you realize that J.D. Vance has endorsed this book, Donald Trump's son has endorsed this book, and these other far-right luminaries have endorsed this book that holds up Franco and Pinochet and these other murderers as heroes for doing to their political opponents what the author says that Republicans who win the next election, in other words, Trump and J.D. Vance, should do to American opponents. And when you put that together with the fact that the Supreme Court, appointed in its majority by Donald Trump, has given him a rubber stamp saying anything you do in your official capacity, say having political opponents thrown from helicopters, or women chained to beds, and having their babies given to good Christian couples, which is what Pinochet did, and have the mother who was in the wrong political party tortured and shot after just delivering birth, that not only is this okay, it is what this book is saying should be done by extension, because these are the author's heroes. This author also believes in Pizzagate, the far-right conspiracy theory that somehow Democrats are controlled by demon-possessed child molesters who run these centers for political leaders to and entertainers from Hollywood to rape children. All this nonsense. Okay, it's off there on the dark web. We don't pay attention, just in the same way that you don't want to look at a traffic accident and someone bleeding out on a sidewalk. Decent people don't. But unfortunately, with the vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, endorsing a book that holds up Pinochet and Franco and other fascist leaders as heroes, we've got to ask a serious question. And that is, when will the mainstream media lift the lid on who these people really are? And I want to add one more thing into this mix, and that is the insanity and the extremism of the current Kennedy candidate, who now has been outed at playing a prank by bringing a dead baby bear and putting it in Central Park. Believe me, I'm not making this crap up. And he also has followers on the far right, conspiracy theorists who say that the vaccine companies are somehow conspiring to give us vaccines that kill our children, and all these things that basically don't bear repetition. But when you look at the extremism of Kennedy with a worm in the brain and as a prankster who puts a dead bear in a park, you look at the extremism of J.D. Vance. And by the way, I have a question for him, and that is, if I had a wife whose family and parentage is Indian, comes from India, I would not be making fun of another woman of color for being a DEI hire as a woman of color when my own wife is also a lawyer and has had the same professional success. And the same thing could be said about her by these kind of lick-spittle, Trump-following, racist, misogynistic, pigs that also endorse a book that holds up as heroes people who had people thrown from helicopters that they disagreed with and said, this is what we have to do in America. We've got to go after the left as enemies that need to be thrown from helicopters. We have to kill them the way they were killed. This is not fantasy. This is what this book promotes. These are its heroes. And it is drawing a direct connection between our present political situation, saying, this is what the far right must do. This is not an exaggeration. If you want to understand J.D. Vance, just understand what he has endorsed in a book. And you don't need to look any further to know what a cruel, misfit, loser, cretin this man is, insulting women of exactly the same profile and profession and color as his own wife. And he's a heartbeat from the presidency if Trump wins. These are extremists. These are dangerous people. If you want the real Republican program endorsed by the vice presidential candidate and the son of the man trying to reclaim the presidency, check out Unhumans, and you will understand where they're really coming from. My name is Frank Schaeffer.
Well, I hope the communication from Frank Schaeffer came across loud and clear. I agree with him top to bottom. It's massively disturbing, the deeply cynical and lethal nature of this fanatical focus on past truly evil dictators, and then to couch all of the in-country dynamics between those in power in government and then the rest of us, the proletariat, if you will, the citizens, to see that as a relationship of those who are in power are the humans, And those of us who are just lowly voting citizens are the unhumans. I can't imagine anything more cynical and lethal and disturbing than that. And it's rolled out to this extreme in the first 6 months of obviously a 4-year, term. So, time to shift gears for one last piece in this, the first episode of 2, as the culmination of this Roots of Fascism 2025 in the USA series. And this last voice I would like to call up is one that, she's brilliant, and she's done a tremendous amount of just extraordinary journalism over the past, gosh, has she been on the air 20 years now? I have a great regard for Rachel Maddow. And this is something that she's offering a statement to someone else's podcast, someone else's program, and she's speaking to their listeners. And she's suggesting that we not make the mistake of, when we hear the mainstream reporting about the Trump administration and the efforts of ICE and so on, being about keeping out the immigrants or deporting the immigrants or abusing the immigrants. And especially these immigrants are the criminals and the worst of the worst. That we would be making a huge mistake. First, to think that they're going to stop at deporting just the criminals and the gang members. That obviously, in the months that have occurred since this was recorded, that I'm about to play for you, we've seen that no, they're clearly not stopping at just the worst of the worst or the criminal element to be deported back to their countries. This is all just a warm-up for what action will be directed toward U.S. citizens at every level. And so I request that you just allow this to roll around in you, to consider this possibility and this actuality, as it's now, again, really already turning out this way. And this is just a couple of months old, this particular clip that I'm about to play for you. And I'm particularly moved by what she finishes up with, which is, again, to just underscore a couple of the most vulnerable populations. Particularly, she talks about the elder population and how if we decimate Social Security, decimate Medicare, Medicaid, that many of these people have nothing to fall back on. There is no safety net beyond this. And so for me, it's quite a moving statement from Rachel Maddow that we're going to be closing up with. I hope you find some depth of resonance with her message. It seems like a very current and very important one for us all.
That Trump has created a military zone along 3 states at the southern border. And I really just encourage your listeners to, whenever they hear something about the Trump administration or the government doing something that relates to immigration or that relates to the border or that is about, that is classified in the news as being that type of a story, just read that story without any attention to the fact that it's about immigrants or it's about the border, because everything that they are doing to immigrants and everything they're doing at the border is a dry run for what they want to do to everybody else, including U.S. citizens and the interior of this country. And so setting up a military zone where they've, for example, at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, they've declared that a non-contiguous miles-long strip of land in another state, in New Mexico, is technically part of Fort Huachuca in Arizona for the purposes of having active duty U.S. military personnel have arrest powers and crowd control powers inside that zone. I mean, just ignore the fact that it's at the border. What that is Trump giving active duty U.S. military the opportunity, the legal authority to arrest U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. That means he's got the U.S. military not on the border facing out, but on the border facing in at us. Like, that's a huge red flag, and it hasn't received a lot of attention, again, because I think it's getting shunted into this idea of like, oh, that's just about the border. The border is all of us, and immigrants are all of us, and there's no bright line between the treatment of immigrants and the treatment of citizens, and don't let them do stuff to immigrants that you would not accede to if they were doing it to you. So that is one. Another thing to watch for, I think, is now, I think, coming into clearer focus, in part because of some good journalism, particularly at places like Wired magazine and at the Washington Post, which is the master database stuff that's happening. So the mystery about Doge and Elon Musk's role in government, as shambolic and stupid as it has been, is that for all of the mistakes they've made and all of the dumb stuff they've done and all the stuff that they've done that's had to be reversed, we can tell sort of what they're not doing. They're not saving money, right? The daily government spending is up under Trump compared to Joe Biden. It's not about saving money. It's also not about, cutting waste and fraud and abuse and rationalizing government spending. It's not that. With all of their embarrassing, even once they acknowledge our mistakes, they haven't fixed them. Right? They haven't stopped doing any of those things. They haven't even slowed down in doing any of those things. So avoiding mistakes or doing anything rationally defensible to the government is not what's going on. What is the thing that they are actually doing? What is the purpose of what they're doing? It is accumulating data. It is getting personal data and sensitive data about every American and every person resident in this country and combining it so that it can be used by an authoritarian leader for his own purposes. Like that's the purpose of Doge. That is what they are doing. And the creation of a master file on everybody in the country is an authoritarian dream. And that is that needs to be stopped in every way that it can be stopped. It needs to be broken once they've assembled it. It needs to be undone. That is something that can't be ignored. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing that I would say is Social Security. We all know that they've been messing with Social Security, and it's had a reasonable amount of attention. But I want to just raise a flag on that for your listeners that is a slow motion disaster. And when you break Social Security, you are breaking things for people who have no other resources and nobody, in many cases, advocating on their behalf. And it is their one lifeline, and they're breaking and messing with that lifeline. And so what they are doing to Social Security, the way they have broken it already, is going to be fatal in this country. And it is up to us as Americans who have resources and who have neighbors and who have family members and who are connected to communities to make sure that elderly and disabled people who need Social Security are not killed by them messing with it and by them interrupting those services and making it impossible for people to get help when they've got trouble with their Social Security payments. And we've got to do some emergency community response. In the way that people have been standing up for immigrants who've been snatched off the streets, we need to stand up for people in our own communities, look in on our elderly and disabled to make sure that what they're doing to Social Security isn't killing people. And we've got to make some people pay politically for what they've done to mess with that, because they are hurting the most vulnerable people in our country. And as Americans.
So thank you for watching this first episode of 2 that wraps up our series on the roots of fascism in the USA 2025. And I hope that you will join us for the second and final round of this particular mini series within a series. What we're going to be doing is giving you really bald-face examples of how each of the 4 groups that were introduced in the earlier series and also in this episode, the Broligarchs, the Christo-fascists, the old-timer masters of the universe, financiers, and the old-timer titans of industry, it needs to get more real. And we don't want to just throw mud and just see what sticks. We actually need to bring in some very clear examples of how each of those four groups, along with virtually all the other groups that make up the Project 2025 Dark Alliance, every one of these four groups is embodying in a corporate or an organizational level the cynical and shadow nature of this remarkably disturbing essence conveyed, as Frank Schaeffer so beautifully laid out for us, the shadow core that is laid out for us to see in the book Unhumans. What we're hearing about is instance after instance of how each of these groups manifests a dehumanization of massive swaths of the US population and, by implication, the global population. This is the real deal, folks. I would not be offering you this kind of fear-mongering, hellacious vitriol if it weren't true. I have this concreted into my system now after much research, much due diligence in this topic. This is really happening. And so I invite you, I warmly invite you to come and join us for the final episode in this series on the roots of fascism, and particularly this final episode on this dark core of dehumanization, the ultimate core of dehumanization of massive swaths of the US population and the global population. I think it's a time to stand together in some way, shape, or form that is larger than I have any idea what it will be. But perhaps we're seeing the seedlings of what it's like to stand together in the recent protests that have been going on here in the USA, here in June of 2025 and beyond. It's hard to say, but I can't imagine a more important time than this one to be standing together in whatever that means for you, whether it's protests or not, whether it's supporting others who are protesting, or whether it's cooking them meals or writing the poetry or writing the songs that we can sing together. It's time to stand together. So I look forward to seeing you and seeing your comments about these episodes in the show notes below. Thank you so much for your participation in the programs here at Living Resilience. I look forward to meeting you soon in one of our meetings. Thank you.
All around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces, bright and early for their daily races, going nowhere, going nowhere. Their tears are filling up their glasses, no expression, no expression. Hide my head, I want to drown my sorrow. No tomorrow, no tomorrow.